Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. We've got a long way to go this morning, and just not enough time to get there. So I hope you'll forgive me for not many amenities this morning. Okay, just got to get right into it as I continue to struggle with my allergies. I should have used my respirator this morning, but I didn't. Okay, I shared with you yesterday morning. I went back over some territory. All 12 tribes were married to Israel. The 10 northern tribes committed spiritual adultery. She was accused of becoming an adulteress. She was accused of being a harlot. Now keep those words in mind, all right? They are important words. They are important theological words. By the way, we have a tendency to think that when the Bible calls a woman a harlot, a whore, then he is simply speaking of an immoral woman, a sexually promiscuous woman. Folks, that is not the predominant meaning of the word. Can it be used of, for instance, a temple harlot to one of the pantheon of Baal? Yes. But in the vast majority of cases, the word that is translated as harlot signifies a wife that has been in marriage covenant and became unfaithful to the covenant. I think this is such a profound point. Because you see, God in Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 23 said that the 10 northern tribes had committed adultery, had played the harlot. He is using adultery and harlotry absolutely interchangeably. Now, I took us yesterday to Matthew chapter 12, 38 and following, in which the Pharisees came to Jesus and said, we would see a sign so that we might believe. And Jesus said, a wicked and an adulterous generation seeks after a sign. I pointed out that Jesus echoes two things here. Number one, he is directly echoing Deuteronomy 32:5, Deuteronomy 32, a prediction of Israel's last days. And in Israel's last days, that last generation would be a wicked and adulterous, perverse generation. She would be an adulterous generation. It is not simply coincidental that Jesus 3 times in the New Testament refers, as we shall see momentarily and drive the point home, refers to his generation as this wicked and adulterous generation. Why does he use that word adulterous? Because to the mind of any Jew, even remotely familiar with Israel's history, they would know that the term adulterous generation meant something very powerful. It meant that divorcement, let's see, just like in Hosea, remember? God divorced the 10 northern tribes. He departed from the 10 northern tribes. He put her to death. So when Jesus comes along in the last days, Hebrews 1:1, and speaks of the people of his day and of his time as the adulterous generation, when we keep in mind that God said Judah would have her harvest just like Israel. Well, if she's going to have her harvest, then she's going to be guilty of the same thing. She's going to be an adulterous generation to bring about her harvest. So in Matthew chapter 12, Verse 38 and following, Jesus says, a wicked and evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, but no sign shall be given except the sign of the son of, the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so also shall the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. Now watch this. The men of Nineveh will rise up in judgment with this generation, because they, men of Nineveh, repented at the preaching of Jonah, and one greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. Now, you got to catch something here. People try to negate the power of and the application of this generation by saying, well, Jesus is just simply, they make two arguments. Jesus is simply talking about this kind of people. The men of Nineveh and the queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with people like them. Folks, that's an abuse, distortion, and perversion of the term this generation. Secondly, that argument completely overlooks the specificity of the text. In verse 41, the men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment, and it says, with this generation. Well, it's literally the generation this. It is hammering home the point that he was speaking about his then living generation. And somebody says, well, it's ludicrous to say that all people were judged at the same time. Well, it's only ludicrous if you have a presuppositional eschatology that refuses to accept the force of clear-cut language. I would say that. Thirdly, the question has to be asked. Okay, the men of Nineveh will rise up with this generation. The queen of the south will rise up with this generation. So here's a question. Was that first century generation judged? Well, anyone that would deny that would be denying the united testimony of church history that they like to cite so well. They would be rejecting the testimony of Josephus. They would be rejecting the testimony of the patristic writers. But most of all, they would be rejecting the testimony of Scripture. And this is just another example of the utter, outright, total desperation of those who want to avoid the indisputable, unavoidable reality that the judgment of men, not of Israel, but a judgment of those wider than Israel, in addition to Israel. It wasn't Israel only that was going to be judged in that generation. Guess what? The men of Nineveh were not Israelites. But they were going to be judged in that generation along with Israel. So much for the ridiculous doctrine of Israel only. So, what have we seen this morning? And we're not through with Matthew chapter 12, okay? What we see this morning is that Jesus drives home the point by his allusion to Deuteronomy 32, by his allusion to this adulterous generation, Jesus is thereby, number one, identifying his generation as the last of Israel's national existence. Number two, he is saying that Israel's divorcement, Israel's death, was going to take place in that generation, because she had become, like her elder sister Israel, a harlot bride, an adulterous wife. Okay, so we'll continue this tomorrow on the flip side. I'll see you there.